Today we're looking at Unit 8, Notes Number 2, Protest for Civil Rights. So we'll be focusing more now on um, the movement in terms of how people are getting involved and how they're organizing. So new struggles. The Brown decision only directly affected schools. A majority of other public facilities still remain segregated. So because laws were so specific and the Brown case was particular to schools being segregated, hotels could have still been segregated, restaurants, buses, trains. So those are still issues that people were trying to change. In Montgomery, Alabama, the African American riders made up 2/3 of the bus passengers. So that's about 67% of the people that rode the bus were African Americans. They were forbidden from sitting in the front rows, which were reserved for white passengers. And they were not even allowed to sit in the same row as a white person. So as the front rows filled up, even if they were in their designated area in the back, once the front filled up, they would have to stand up and offer their seat. So while this is the case of it's equal, or they say it's equal, separate but equal, but it's not, because they're paying the same amount of money, but they're not entitled to a seat. They aren't guaranteed a seat, or it's not treated fairly. So the bus boycott. In 1955, a local NAACP member, Rosa Parks, boarded a Montgomery bus after work and sat in the section reserved for African Americans. Once the white section filled up, she was ordered to give up her seat. She refused and was arrested. So she had been working all day, again, paid the same amount as the other person. She was there first and didn't feel that she should have to stand up. So she made it a point, kind of knew what was going to happen, to bring awareness to the situation. So as a result, the NAACP called for a one-day boycott of the buses. And so boycotts become a new form of protest. So like in this case with the bus system, these African American riders, they're paying customers, but yet they're not getting the same treatment, the same product, if you will. And so by doing a boycott, what you're trying to show is, you're trying to point out to businesses is that this demographic, African Americans, play a huge part in the economy of your business, the profits. So if you're not buying that product, hopefully you can change their opinion in showing them that this has to change, because if not, you're going to lose money, because more than half of the people that ride your bus are African American. So while you want to pander to your white customers, they're not the majority of your customers. Your majority of your customers are African Americans. So the one-day boycott was successful. 90% of African American riders stayed off the buses that day. Due to the success of a boycott, community leaders decided to continue with the Montgomery bus boycott. So here are a few pictures of Rosa Parks being arrested and her mugshot. And so she was a young woman. She had been working all day. She was a member of the NAACP, so she was kind of active in this, the idea of civil rights. So definitely was something done kind of intentional, if you will, to kind of draw attention to what was happening. A new leader. So the group selected a young minister at a local Baptist church named Martin Luther King Jr., or MLK, as the leader of the bus boycott. He was a Baptist minister with a bachelor's degree in sociology, and he received a doctorate in philosophy. So Martin Luther King kind of becomes this, from this bus boycott, this unofficial leader of the mainstream civil rights movement. He was well-spoken. He was highly educated. He had a clear idea and message and purpose of where he wanted the movement to go and where he didn't want it to go. He didn't want it to become negative and violent. He wanted to keep people focused on the ultimate goal, which was to integrate and to end segregation and keeping a positive movement. MLK was known for being a great speaker, so he was able to inspire people, engage them, motivate them, attract more people to the movement. So that was one of the main qualities. Later on, probably next week, we'll listen to the I Have a Dream speech. The boycott continues. Many of the African Americans in Montgomery depended on the buses for transportation. A lot of the African Americans in the community did not own their own cars, so they would use the buses to get into the town, to get to work, to school, and back and forth. And so the boycott hurt the bus systems and many other white businesses. So if they weren't taking the buses, they weren't going into the city, they weren't shopping, they weren't. It had a more kind of a snowball effect than what people originally thought. So African Americans who took part in the boycott were often harassed. MLK and other leaders became targets of violent threats. So when people are losing money, instead of reevaluating their policies, they're choosing to, at first, blame other people. So court challenges to segregation on city buses also moved forward during the boycott. So if you can't get people to change on their own, the idea was to change the laws and force them into those changes. In 1956, the Supreme Court ruled that segregation on buses was unconstitutional. Birth of SCLC. The success of the Montgomery bus boycott inspired African Americans elsewhere to organize their own boycotts. In January of 1957, a new group was formed known as the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. The goal of this group was to organize protest activities all across the South, and MLK was elected its leader. So they're finding businesses, maybe restaurants, lunch counters, movie theaters, places that still continue to have segregated areas, and they're going to peacefully organize to protest those policies. So the SCLC was open to people of all faiths and races, and it was committed to mass nonviolent action. So this protest, the idea of protest, is just them maybe having signs, having a picket line, but it's meant to draw attention to these policies and to these businesses that continue to use segregation. But it was not meant to be violent in any way. So, strategy of nonviolence. Many of the tactics used in the civil rights movement were based on those of Mohandas Gandhi. Gandhi was a leader in India's struggle for independence from Great Britain. He taught that a nonviolent approach would expose injustice and force those in power to end it. And so this idea is that, again, you put the focus on these policies like segregation and the people that are using those policies. Because if you're using violence, the attention is now on you, your behavior. And so that's not what Martin Luther King wanted. He wanted the attention and the focus to be on the actions that they wanted to change, which was segregation. They wanted to draw attention to why this is unethical, it's not equal, it's not fair, it does a disservice. And so that was his goal. And he knew that being violent would only draw negative attention to them. And so by continuing to being nonviolent, it does gain support, it does gain more sympathy and empathy to your movement. So MLK was one of the many civil rights leaders who shared in Gandhi's views. Next week we will talk about other civil rights leaders who did not necessarily agree with this strategy, and we'll start to see more divisions as the movement goes on. So registering voters. In 1961, Attorney General Robert Kennedy urged the movement to focus on voter registration rather than on protests. In 1962, CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality and Other Groups, founded the Voter Education Program, VEP, to register Southern African Americans to vote. So the idea is that if you want to change laws, you want to change policies, you need to elect people that are going to be sympathetic and agree with your perspective, that represent you. So that all starts by being able to vote. And so if the African American community is not voting, then they're not voting for people to correctly represent them in Washington and to make those changes that are needed. So James Farmer was the director of CORE. Freedom Riders were sent to the South to register voters. And so people see this they know the power of voting and how it can affect who's elected and what changes are. So the fact that they're going down and registering voters, people see that as potential threat. So many of these volunteers that are going down, freedom riders, are often met with harassment, threats against them. In January of 1964, the 24th Amendment was passed by Congress. This banned states from taxing citizens to vote. So, new legislation. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 banned discrimination in employment and in public accommodations. The SCLC would now shift its focus to voting rights. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed in Congress by large majorities. It eliminated voter literacy tests and allowed federal examiners to register voters rather than local officials, knowing that sometimes local officials can try to create loopholes to prevent people from registering to vote. And so with new legislation, we begin to see changes, making an effort in terms of the federal government trying to prevent a lot of these roadblocks for people trying to vote. So it is making great progress. So this is the end of the notes. You want to make sure you go back and update any key terms that you may have missed. And then if you haven't done the notes for 8.1, you go back and do that.